Professoressa, parli con...
als Seminar untereinander gestalten würden, diese Stunde, die wir anderthalb Stunden zusammen verbringen werden. Es ist natürlich sehr viel, ich weiß es. Es ist auch die Logistik hilft nicht. Also diese frontale Disposition ist also überhaupt nicht geeignet. Ich weiß nicht, ob ihr noch euch vielleicht nicht an die alten Tische der Liberation erinnert, vielleicht überhaupt nicht, wo man sich auf den Tisch, vielleicht Matteo erinnert sich, wo man gute Gespräche führen konnte. Aber versuchen wir auch mit der Imagination uns alle an einem runden Tisch und versuchen wir auch einer Kommunikation, weil das auch Institution in der deutschsprachigen akademischen Kultur, wenn wir wollen, oder nicht die Lehrveranstaltungen. Anders bei uns ist es immer weniger. Aber versuchen wir das als Materialien habt ihr schon bekommen, glaube ich. Also, man soll sich keinen Stress machen. Hier wird man nicht auf bewertet und evaluiert, je nachdem, was man sagt. Ein Gespräch anzufangen. Und mit bei Januars die Dinge zeigen kann, die interessant sind. Wir versuchen jetzt vielleicht ein bisschen weniger Licht zu haben.
Ja, wir versuchen,
wir mal sehen. Allora,
ho il video del link, però
è collegato con la pianta? Se no mi devo collegare col mio? Non vedo, no?
no, perché si vede dietro.
Ah, scusa, ma tieni questo collegato? Ma se no,
Sì.
tieni due account.
Il problema
E fai copresentare.
Collegare con l'account, gli ho mandato il link, però non è arrivato.
Se vuoi fare? Allora. Posso fare col mio? Mi fai
anche con il mio non è un
tu lo vedi? Allora, allora. Ecco, qui vedo collegate, ci sono Marta, Enrica, Jessica. Ci sentite da casa?
Sì, vi sentiamo bene adesso.
Allora, la raccomandazione è quella di partecipare, perché questo è un seminario, non abbiate timore di intervenire liberamente. Va bene? Vale anche per Città Laggiù. Va bene?
Sì, grazie.
Stiamo allestendo i collegamenti.
Sie versuchen gerade den Dokument jetzt. Ja, yes. Okay. Okay. Scusate per questo ritardo, forse ce l'abbiamo quasi fatta. Nel frattempo magari parlo 2 minuti del progetto. Sì, è vero. Magari dell'attesa posso parlare 2 minuti del progetto. Vielleicht kann ich über das Projekt einen Moment sprechen. Entschuldigung für mein Deutsch. Unser Projekt wurde im November geboren und wir haben manche Seminare schon organisiert und das war eine echte Ehre, mit uns Federico Italiano, Arno Rossini haben. Und jetzt ist unser vielleicht letztes Termin für dieses Jahr. Und das ist sehr schön, dass Professor Christine Ivanovic mit uns ist. Und das freut uns wirklich. Und heute werden wir über ein Gedicht von Zählen Wahnsinn sprechen, das Tod Naubeck heißt. Und über eine sehr spezifische Weise für Übersetzung, das ist der homophonische Übersetzung, so eine Sorte phonetische Übersetzung. Und vielleicht haben wir das Grundzeit. Das sollte alles gut sein. Ich werde Ok, quindi la professoressa Ivanovic ci parlerà della traduzione omofonica di questa poesia di Celan. E sono sicura che sarà molto interessante anche perché noi ne abbiamo sentito un po' parlare nelle lezioni che lei sta svolgendo per il corso di studi in Anglo-American Studies. Ok. Ok. Okay. Ich werde vielleicht auch. Okay. Okay. Danke. Entschuldigung. So.
Also, durch das Mikro nehmen. Ist das besser so? Ja. Vielen Dank für die nette Einladung, dass ich heute hier mit Ihnen dieses Gedicht besprechen darf. Ich habe jetzt ein kleines Problem, nämlich ich komme ja eigentlich aus Deutschland oder aus Wien und habe sehr viel über Celan gearbeitet. Ich habe jetzt aber diese Einladung zu dem heutigen Seminar mit Serena auf Englisch kommuniziert. Und irgendwie ist meine Erwartung gewesen, dass ich heute auf Englisch Ihnen vortragen soll. Das heißt, mein Paper ist Englisch. Ist das okay für Sie? Es ist sehr komisch, also als deutsche Muttersprache über Celan auf Englisch zu sprechen, aber in diesem Fall ist es vielleicht ganz interessant, weil es um Charles Bernstein geht und darum, wie dieses Gedicht auf Englisch weitergedacht worden ist. Also ich werde jetzt auf Englisch wechseln, es tut mir leid, aber wir können auch später, wenn es für Sie leichter ist, in beiden Sprachen das machen.
Das ist sozusagen besser, weil diese Initiative auch von anderen noch
Okay. So it was just a point of misunderstanding because our communication was in English, and I was thinking that I had to present this in English. So we will switch to English now. Next time when you come to Vienna, we will talk about Celan in German. I hope so. I can only invite you to come and contact me and to continue with it. Okay, so today, as you know, we want to deal with the poem Todtnauberg. Todtnauberg is a very famous poem by Paul Celan. It appeared in his 8th poetry volume, Zeitgehöft. This is very important. It is number 8 from 8 volumes. We know by him, he composed by himself more or less, but Celan himself had prepared this volume for printing, had not anymore prepared this volume for printing. It has been edited from his estate. The volume appeared in the only after his suicide in the fall of 1917. But the poem itself was written several years earlier, in the year of 1967, and this is a very, very important year, not only for the oeuvre of Paul Celan, it's for world history and for cultural theory, a very, very important year. This year 67, as you know, I suppose, is widely recognized as a year of turns with respect to both political and theoretical movements. And it is likewise a major juncture in Paul Celan's late poetry. So today we can recognize a significant divide between the body of Celan's poetry that had gained public recognition, and the enormous number of poems he composed at the same time in this very year of 67, but did not release to the public. This prolific period resulted in a total of 157 poems he composed in 1 year only, in 1967. Most of those poems long remained obscure due to their delayed publication across several volumes in the subsequent years. So we have to have a very close look at the date when Celan composed the poem and when the poem was released. But we can now recognize this very dense period of the year 67, where his volume Atem wenn der Breathturm came out of print, when he composed most of the poems of the next volume, Fadensonne, Thread Songs, and he started to compose also poems of the 7th volume, Schneepart, and also poems of this last volume, Zeitgehöft. So it's a dense period, but in our way we are perceiving his late work, we don't know that those poems are composed in this very short time. Know that we have a meticulously annotated edition of Celan's complete poetic oeuvre. There's easy access to an abundance of information relating to the creation of each respective poem. The close reading of all of Celan's poems within their historical and biographical context has become possible. So what I can do, but maybe I will not do it too, I will not elaborate it too much, but it's very interesting to delve into this question about what happened with this very year of 67, which was the apex of Celan's poetry, and on the other side, a very important year of political turns and cultural turns. And but I will more concentrate on this poem, Totnauberg, which Celan composed in July 67. As it's well known, this poem reflects Celan's first personal encounter with the prominent German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And if we take this poem as an immediate statement on this event, then it exposes the poem as an ideal opportunity for discussing the gap between that what we are supposed to know when we read Celan's poem and that what the text literally tells us, because all the data we know about this meeting Heidegger at Totnauberg is data we got from others, from his biography, but not data really literally offered in the poem itself. So we have to reflect on this gap. At the same time, this practice generated a matrix of how to read Celan's work as that of the eminent poet of the Holocaust in German literature, who remained attracted by Heidegger's philosophy and who remained skeptical of Heidegger's unresolved Nazi past simultaneously. So reading Celan's poems within the broader context of the enduring political and theoretical changes, especially of this very year of 67, can become even more aware of how much Celan paradigmatically represents the post-Holocaust condition. His struggle with the trauma of the Holocaust extends to what had happened to him, his family, his friends, and his homeland during the early 40s, and to what had happened to him in the course of the so-called Goll plagiarism affair. It was in this very year, 67, that Celan eventually made his own attempts at self-positioning within post-war society, mirrored in a split world where the generational gap, the unmastered legacy of the Holocaust in the Second World War, and the global extension of the Cold War gave rise to fresh acts of open violence. Reading Celan's poems within this framework might open up a new way of understanding what his poems were aiming at, actualized language, as he put it in his Meridian speech some years before. I think I will, due to time constraints, I will skip more or less what I have prepared about these coincidences with other very important events in this year of 67. I will just pick one thing which is which seems very important to me. It's I have to see where I continue in my paper. We have to reconsider that this year of 67 was, as I told you, or as I mentioned it before, a year of change, not only in relation to the biography of Celan. At the same moment that we recognize a definite turning point in his own life and work due to his illness, due to his hospitalization and so on, the world around him was also facing a new escalation of violent conflicts and a significant turn in cultural theory and practice. It was the year of where the Vietnam War started. The race riots in the United States were very violent, and it was in Germany the beginning of the student protests, not only in Germany, but this spread it to Paris, Japan, Mexico, and all over the world. It was the beginning of the pop culture and the post-structuralism, all that defining moments in this very year. And I have to remember that in June 67, the growing tensions in the Near East are unleashed in the Six-Day War from 5th to 11th June. And at the same time, violence escalated in Germany, and protests against the visit of the Persian Shah are brutally suppressed by police who shoot the student Benno Ohnesorg in Berlin the 2nd of June. So all these things happened in a very short period. Celan explicitly references these developments in his poetry. There's the poem Denkdir, Imagine, where he reacts to the events in Israel. And in the poem Einem Bruder in Asien, to a brother in Asia, composed 10 days after he sketched Todtnauberg, Celan comments on the war in Vietnam. Other events, however, go conspicuously unmentioned, and particularly, and this is very striking for me, the shooting of German student Benno Ohnesorg by the German police, which had become a major public talking point in Germany during the latter half of '67, and which would remain so in the years to come, remains unmentioned by him. He never went into this point, even if this was the start of the RAF terrorism organization, the protests and violent protests in Germany and so on. It's very important events in Berlin and in Germany. Celan was undoubtedly aware of this, and he has also been informed not only by media reports, but also by personal testimonies of his friends. On the side of the academia, both Theodor Adorno as well as literary critic Peter Sondy, a close friend of Celan's, were not only engaging theoretically with the debate on violence and a free university, but they were also directly involved in these events. And they were talking, especially Sondy were mentioning this and talking to Celan about that. And on the other hand, we have to recollect that '67 is a milestone in the realm of cultural theory and practice. It is the year in which Richard Rorty's anthology, The Linguistic Turn, documented a decisive development in the philosophical history of the 20th century, providing a landmark term for contemporary debates. And at the same time, the publication of Derrida's founding books on grammatology and so on, all his books marked the transformation of French cultural theory from structuralism to post-structuralism. And it was exactly Celan's employer at that time, the École Normale Supérieure, which was at the center of this paradigm shift. Both Louis Althusser and Jacques Derrida were working at this very place. It was the working place of Celan in Paris, the École Normale. And this school was also where Jacques Lacan held his famous Séminaire hebdomadaire. In '67, Lacan invited Michel Foucault to the École Normale to present his newly published book, Les mots et les choses. To what extent Celan was aware of these events, given his ongoing illness, remains unclear. However, he reportedly did have an exchange with Heidegger about contemporary French philosophy during his trip to Freiburg. So I just wanted to sketch these data to see what was the horizon of their conversation. It was not only the question of Heidegger's engagement in National Socialism, it was this whole period or moment of turning things around. It was really a paradigm shift in theory, in the behavior of the society, of the students, the generation shift. All these things came together in this very year, and at that moment when Celan went to Heidegger in Freiburg. So these are the only briefly sketched general conditions under which Celan's poem Todtnauberg was written. I will list them shortly. First, it was a very fragile state of health of Celan, who in this very year was trying to cope with the mental illness, which has undoubtedly due to the traumatic experiences during the time of the Holocaust and the Gaulle affair. Most of the year he was in hospital. He was being treated for his mental illness. He made a first suicide attempt at the end of January '67, and then from April on he was released. Partly he could go out and leave the hospital, but finally he was hospitalized until the end of September of that year. So his trip to Freiburg was kind of a vacation from the hospital. And we have to keep that in mind. Second point is the change in the political situation, not only in Germany, France, and Europe, but also worldwide. It marked the end of the post-war period and a new peak of military escalations, be it Israel's war of liberation in early June 67, to which Celan had reacted enthusiastically, or be it the war in Vietnam. And the third point is the turn in theoretical debate, the so-called linguistic turn, which had significant consequences for art theory, but also for the formation of discourse. And I think this poem stands at the beginning of this critical discourse theory, which ultimately also aimed at overcoming positions such as those represented by Heidegger and to make a new political consciousness possible. The strengthening Celan experienced at the beginning of June, when there was the 6 days war in Israel and the shooting of Beno Onesog in Germany, Celan on his side experienced kind of a strengthening. He felt better health, and this prompted him to accept an invitation which has been already he got already in the fall of the previous year. But then he wrote a letter to Gerhard Baumann, the Freiburg professor of German, and said, well, yes, I would love to come to Freiburg and give my lecture now. And he himself insisted at this point of time on holding a lecture on very short notice. So when he came to Freiburg, and this is really unbelievable for today, 1,000 people came to listen to this lecture of Celan's in Freiburg. Can you imagine that nowadays a poet comes and reads poems and there are 1,000 people in a small university city like Freiburg? It's unimaginable. Really, I find it very impressive. So over 1,000 people attended his lecture in the Great Hall of the Collegiate Building 2 at Freiburg University. It was a building erected only a few years earlier, between 57 and 62. So it was a new university building, the Freiburg, this huge collegiate building 2. It was erected, newly constructed on the grounds of the synagogue destroyed during Reichskristallnacht. We also have to remember this. This was the place where Celan gave his lecture, on the grounds where the former synagogue has been destroyed during the Kristallnacht. And there was this new university building. A plaque at the country yard in front of the building still commemorates this event, but there's grass growing around and nobody has a look at this plaque. Nobody mentions this anymore. The building was only 5 years old. Nobody mentioned what this place and the events which have to be commemorated at this very place. Neither in his poem nor in any other form did Celan ever reference to those events at this very place to those dates. Instead, the poem which he composed a few days after his stay at Freiburg focuses exclusively on the small village of Todtnauberg, located outside of the city of Freiburg in the Black Forest and home to Heidegger's private hut or cabin, Hütte. It was reportedly Celan himself who insisted on a trip to that cabin during his visit. So he and Heidegger met at Celan's hotel the day after the lecture. I have to also mention, because it's for me personally very important, Celan came to Freiburg, had his lecture with this huge audience. The next day they went to Todtnauberg, had this conversation, this event at this hut, and the day after, Celan left Freiburg. And that very day, after their visit at Todtnauberg, another famous person came to Freiburg. And this was Hannah Arendt. And she came to the same building where Celan had had his lecture, and she gave her very famous lecture on Benjamin and Brecht, where she was very aggressive against Adorno's reading of Benjamin's. And she also had 1,000 people in the auditory, and Heidegger was again there. So one day he shook hands with Celan, and the other day with Hannah Arendt, and this was also a very peculiar, very critical companionship, as to say it this way. But the curious thing is that Celan left Freiburg. Celan did not stay there, and Celan never met Hannah Arendt, never talked to her. but he talked to Heidegger. I think this is worthwhile mentioning because this was another very important historical moment. Hannah Arendt's lecture at Freiburg, and Celan, who retracted, who went to Frankfurt and who would not meet Hannah Arendt. And it's impossible that Heidegger did not, that anybody did not mention, well, tomorrow there will be Hannah Arendt. She's a guest from the United States. Would you like to stay here and meet her? He could have met her, but he didn't. He stayed with Heidegger and he wanted to go to the heart. So what is the story, or what is the history after Heidegger's cabin or hut or Hütte, as Pierre Joris prefers not to translate the term? Heidegger had retreated himself to his cabin for several years, having been suspended from his university post by the Allied forces after the end of the war, that is from 46 through 51. And it was French intellectuals such as Jean Beaufret, and with him, Beaufret's former student Jean-François Lyotard, and other French students and young intellectuals who had visited Heidegger there at this very place in that time of his retraction, where he was not allowed even to enter the university building of Freiburg. That version is very, very harsh regulations against Heidegger to be present in Freiburg. And there were the French intellectuals who came and visited him at this hut. So we also have to keep this in mind, that maybe Celan, who was in a very close connection with René Char, for instance, that they told him about, you have to go there, you have to meet Heidegger, you have to talk to him. He's different. Maybe this was something which we also have to take into consideration. So among the later visitors, there was a poet to whom I mentioned Celan was close for a time, the former French resistance fighter, René Char, who came to Tottenauberg in 1955 and met with Heidegger there several times over the years until a falling out in 1973. What Celan was also aware of before his visit there on July 25th in 1967, according to Otto Pögeler, was the fact that Heidegger had allowed his cabin to be used by the Nazi regime for training camps conducted by the SS organization Tod. So this is the whole specter of this very, very peculiar place in the Black Forest. We recall that only a few weeks before Celan's encounter with Heidegger there, the Six-Day War had taken place in Israel, and this war had moved the world, and it had led to riots around the world. The reactions were very strong when this war happened all over the world, and there were many anti-Semitic reactions against Israel in the whole world at the time of these Six-Day Wars. Celan in Paris wrote his poem Denkdir, Imagine, in connection with this war, in which he formulates a statement in favor of Israel. And this poem, Denkdir, had appeared in the renowned Neue Zürcher Zeitung shortly before his visit to Freiburg. So this poem, Denkdir, was the most recent poem Celan had ever published when he went to Heidegger. So undoubtedly, this poem also constituted a test for the conversations in Freiburg and the encounter with Heidegger. However, despite the evident topicality of recent events in Israel, it appears that those were not part of their conversation. We don't have any testimony, any mentioning of this context, but it really seems to me impossible that they didn't talk about that this wasn't still in their minds. It was a very harsh, very recent war. It was a shock for the whole world, and then Celan came to Heidegger and nobody talked about that. Impossible. However, nevertheless, there are some connection points between the two poems, Denkdir and Tottenauberg. Maybe I think I have it here. How can I manage now this? See. I think I have the poem here. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, just a moment. I thought I have. Yes, here's the poem. Denk dir, I just allow me to read it for a second. Denk dir, der Moorsoldat von Masada bringt sich Heimat bei aufs Unausschlösslichste, wider allen Dorn im Draht. Denk dir, die Augenlosen ohne Gestalt führen dich frei durchs Gewühl, du erstarkst und erstarkst. Denk dir, deine eigene Hand hat dies wieder ins Leben emporgelittene Stück bewohnbarer Erde gehalten. Denk dir, das kam auf mich zu, namenwach, handwach, für immer vom Unbestattbaren her. There are some connection points between this poem and the later Tod Nauberg. Just think about this, der Moorsoldat von Masada bringt sich Heimat bei, or the motive of the eyes, and so on. So I think there are a number of central phrases and words from Denk dir which reappear only weeks later in the poem Tod Nauberg: homeland, thinking, eyes, names, Bedburg. The gathering of thought in a Heideggerian sense, of which the earlier poem says, Denk dir, das kam auf mich zu, seems to correspond the expressed Hoffnung auf eines Denkenden, kommendes Wort im Herzen from Tod Nauberg. It's like an echo from this earlier poem, provided that we take seriously the dialogical character of Celan's poem, where speech is directed at the other, towards the other, and where speech longs to reach the other through this act of speaking. And we may also recall that Celan had developed the idea of the poem as a place that transcends the schema of a signified and signifier already in 1960 in his Büchner Prize speech. The poem is the very place it references through its speech, a place where language becomes an event unto itself. And this poem, Denk dir, imagine, is very much such an event of the way it speaks. So the movement of the speaker marks this place as a passage as formulated in Celan's 1958 Bremen address, or as a circular movement as formulated in the Meridian. In the poem Tod Nauberg, Celan's reference to a real place marked by the traces of history now provokes the experience of thought as Heidegger sought to express it, in the way in which he unites speaking and remembering and related both in updated form to the present. The poem Tod Nauberg reflects Celan's visit to Heidegger, and it can be read as a recapitulation of his excursion to this cabin in the Black Forest. The various stages can be clearly gleaned from the text. We go back to the text. Yeah, here we have it. So the various stages of this visit can be clearly gleaned from the text. First, the situation in front of the cabin, then Celan makes an entry in the visitor's log, then they walk through the bog, then they have the discussion on the drive back. The final conversation during the car ride, the poem also mentions, however, marks not the end point of the poem. Rather, this conversation is embedded in an evocation of the previous trip to the bog as a central space of remembrance. And such, it's the same place Celan referenced it before in this poem, Denk dir. So in the course of the poem Tod Nauberg, we have kind of chronicle of this visit at Heidegger's hut, but it does not end with the conversation, but it ends with this walk through the Bedburg, die halb beschrittenen Klippepfade im Hochmoor, feuchtes Viel, are the very last words of this poem. Celan dated the publication of the poem Tod Nauberg as Frankfurt Main, 1st of August 1967, and he made an exceptional investment in an expensive private print of this poem. The first of the 50 numbered prints, which had been printed in January 68 in Vaduz in Liechtenstein, Celan sent to Heidegger. And number 46, he personally handed later to Gerhard Baumann, the Freiburg professor, who was the one who had invited him during another visit in Freiburg in the spring of 68. The poem was at first circulated exclusively within a very small circle of readers, and it was not available at all to the public until the appearance of the volume Lichtzwang in June 71, 1 year after Celan's suicide. And it's interesting that here in this volume, the poem Tod Nauberg does not have an exceptional place, as for instance the Todesvogel, which is a separate part of his first book, or the very important positions of the cycle Stimmen, Voices, the first poem in Sprachgitter and Engführungsbrett, the last one. This Tod Nauberg appears anywhere at some place in the volume Lichtzwang in 71. Yes, so in this volume, the striking position in the middle of the second cycle of poems stands in contrast to the exclusivity of the first publication in this special art print Celan dedicated to Heidegger in the beginning of 68. The witnesses to the Tod Nauberg encounter Baumann himself, but especially his then assistant Neumann, they maintained their silence about the events for decades. Looks better, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. So we don't. We know what happened, we have the data of this visit, but those persons who really witnessed what had happened, who went through the padbock with Celan and Heidegger, was in the car, Gerhard Neumann, they never talked about it. I personally, when I had the opportunity to talk to Gerhard Neumann, I asked him, tell me, please, as many of my colleagues did. He never wouldn't. And he just, after he's dead, there has been kind of memoir being published by Gerhard Neumann, but he also does not say what was it really, what Heidegger said to Celan and vice versa. And nobody really gives us word about what was the content of these conversations. Among the first commentators not involved in the then events were Hans-Georg Gadamer, Otto Pöggeler, and George Steiner in a very decisive paper, Heidegger Again, published by Steiner in 1890. Ever since the 1990s, there has been an ongoing debate surrounding Heidegger's involvement in National Socialism. Celan's visit to Tod Nauberg has become an event of symbolic importance in that debate, an event that the poem itself represents. In light of this fact, readings that ignore reports about Celan's visit to Freiburg and Tod Nauberg seem impossible. So for today, we are just always discussing the visit itself, but not the poem. It seems to be impossible to read the poem as it is without referencing these biographical facts. Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe was the first who was very critical about that, and he, by this poem, coined the term birth of hagiography with Celan, and he said, be careful, this is not in order to read the poems just in this biographical way, there is more to them. Yes, he was critically in reference not only to the lengthy debate surrounding the poem and the details of Celan's relation to Heidegger, but also to a hagiography that had lasting effects on the reading of Celan's work in general. The singularity of the poem, which Celan emphasized by having it printed on its own stands in contrast to the contextualization of its later publication in the volume Lichtzwang, also it would appear. In the most recent edition of Celan's collected poetry, editor Barbara Wiedemann points out that the otherwise strict chronological sequence in the second section of this volume, the midpoint of which is marked by Tod Nauberg, is strikingly disturbed. Lichtzwang is the last volume that Celan himself put together, and it begins with two poems composed like Denktier during the Six-Day War. So this volume begins with Celan remembering the Six-Day War in his poems, and then it floats the otherwise regular chronological order appearing just before Tod Nauberg. So there's another poem which Celan had composed during the Six-Day War, which has been positioned immediately directly before Tod Nauberg in the volume Lichtzwang. So we should be careful and read the poem also in the context of his volume and this composition, and with Celan's reference to what happened in Israel in that very year. This arrangement visually confronts the journey to the memory space of the penbook with a text that evokes a landscape of mud. Schlamm, Schutkan, Schlamm are the words which come in the other poem, so there are other references too. In this poem, two past events are called into question in the face of current experience in the context of the war in Israel. So what Celan's poem Tod Nauberg makes audible in the form of visible silence is more than merely the missing explanations from Heidegger. And this is the argument I would like to make stronger, to read the poem with reference to Heidegger, yes, but not only, to see a more broader context and what Celan did express in his poems goes far beyond this question, what did Heidegger say, what did Celan say? In contrast to the emphatic act of talking to the other in the poem Denktier, this is Denktier, there's somebody speaking to another, to a counterpart. It's a completely different situation. Very strong in this poem, Denktier. And this talking to the other unites the contemporary and the remembered. He is also remembering the events at Masada in the biblical times and the contemporary events in Israel now. He's bringing those things together. And so this is a very strong context also for a contrast to the poem Tod Nauberg, as it seems to me. Neither in the entry in the visitor's log in Heidegger's cabin, nor in the conversation during the drive, we have something similar to this strong performance of speaking. Tod Nauberg can only summarize what was seen, what was thought, what was said with the indeterminate collective adjective feel. Feel much is the last word. This is the summarizing a word for what cannot be expressed at single words, at single events. It's not the act of speaking which is present here as we experience it in the other poem, Denktier. What I would like to point to is a perspective on the poem that goes beyond the biographical reading that is the generally accepted approach to Celan's poem Tod Nauberg. Yes, it bears the name of the place in its title. And yes, the poem has been composed shortly after Celan's encounter with Heidegger. And yes, he has sent the poem in a luxurious print to the philosopher a few months later. But the question that remains is, can the poem be read only in this form, as a message to Heidegger that has taken the form of a poem, or is Tod Nauberg precisely through this, the prototype of that poem of Celan's, which addresses itself to a counterpart, which moves toward this counterpart, which passes through the uncanny, and this was a very, very much uncanny encounter at this Heidegger's hut in the Black Forest, and which sets itself free there. So it really does what the Meridian speech is talking about. We can we see this as like a performance in this poem. So now we come to the American language poet Charles Bernstein, who has, I think, taken seriously this project of Celan's model of what the poem wants, as he said it out in his Meridian speech, in a way no one else has done it before. In a short paper to the journal Textual Practice, Charles Bernstein presents and explains a translation of Todd Nauberg as textual practice. So the title of the review of the journal is Textual Practice, but we have here a very striking paradigm of textual practice of reading and translating this poem by Celan. I have forwarded this paper to you, and I hope you had time to read it. It's a really very interesting paper. And I would like now to discuss this paper in more detail. Have a look at Bernstein's approach, which starts from Pierre Jory's previous reflection on the poem and its translation. And now I would like, if you can, to listen to Bernstein reading. I don't know how we can manage this. Yeah, I hope it will. Yeah. It's correct.
Arnica full in trust, clear, trump out, dim, roots, emit, dim, stern, waffle, drought, indigo, hot, died in that bush, lesson, dim, lines, again, died, dies, gusts, rhythms, fail, island, hurt, hawks, war, folded, veil. Arnica hold in trust, tear, trump out, dim, bruise, emit, dim, stern, waffle, drought, indigo, hot, die in that bush, lesson.
Okay, thank you. So if you just put Bernstein and Todd Nauberg in your browser search field, you can listen again at home if you like. There's also another version where Bernstein is reading this poem in a way like the disc jockey is mixing up the music, so it has this whole effects, very, very uncanny. As far as I know, Bernstein's son is a disc jockey, and he mixed this audio file for him again, and it's even better. So if you like, have a look at this again at home. So Bernstein presents under the title Celan's Folds and Whales several translations of the poem into English and accompanies this constellation with a short essay. You have this in your hands. He begins with this sentence, and I now have to. I don't know why I cannot manage the presentation. This doesn't work here. Can we go to another format? This? The full screen?
Maybe it's because we have Zoom here.
Okay, no problem. So I can mention it only with this.
Now maybe it works. Yes.
No, this works.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So you have is on the paper is sent to you. The left column, the version of Charles Bernstein, on the right column, the version of Todd Nauwerk by Celan. There's some images from Todd Nauwerk and also images of the plants. The poem is mentioning the yellow arnica, the albatross on the right side. The orchis, you have a historical photo of Heidegger in front of his hut with well, and this wooden dais in the shape of a star. And you have another picture on the right down there where you see this catalog where Heidegger had been forced to write down his name and to sign this book, and this is what the poem is about. There's another picture of Heidegger. This is the thing, and this is what we have. This is just the cover of this very exclusive print Celan sent to Heidegger. Yes, now we are here. One of the most important sentences of Bernstein in his paper. He begins the paper with this strong sentence: "No poet cracks open the possibilities for translation more than Paul Celan. With Celan, translation is not a supplemental activity, but a hermeneutic necessity." So this is the idea of Bernstein, to use translating as an instrument of reading and knowing and interpreting, approaching this, what Celan was telling us in his poem. Bernstein's approach of using translation as a genuine form of hermeneutic knowledge acquisition seems to me particularly worthy of consideration. It corresponds to a current tendency among numerous authors worldwide not to use translation instrumentally as a medium of linguistic transfer, but to assign the work of translation as a cognitive function of its own. This brief commentary, Bernstein concludes, Celan's poems are not so much in German as acts on German. And this is also a very strong formulation which we can keep in mind, as they found much truth in it. Acts on German. The dialectically expressive strata of his poems are not their destination, but their material subject. It is to this materiality of language that Bernstein devotes his particular attention in his examination of the poem, derived from translation as practice and from comparing various translations. So this is also important. If we compare various translations, we have a multiple approach to the original text. Even if we don't know the original language, we can, through the varieties of the translation, recognize even more than we read only one translation. In his contribution, Bernstein first presents the translation you have just heard. It follows the principle of homophonic translation, which is also called surface translation. What does this mean? One can identify the surface of a text with its writing or with its sound. The Austrian poet Ernst Jandl, only a little younger than Celan, was among the first who developed a procedure of homophonic translation. That was at the end of the 1950s, in which the aim was not to translate an English poem in its meaning, but rather to reproduce the course of the sound course of the poem, according to Jandl himself. His translation of a poem by William Wordsworth, developed according to this approach, became very famous. We have here on the right side the poem by William Wordsworth, a romantic poem which Jandl translated in this Oberflächenübersetzung, surface translation. He tried to reshape, reconstruct the sound structure, the course of the sound of the English poem in German language poem, and at the same time it was kind of a satirical approach and working of this romantic poem. Jandl's version is by no means mere nonsense. And on closer listening and looking, one discovers that in the translation, a complex confrontation takes place both with the poetics of Wordsworth's Romanticism and with the German language. You see words you know, maybe when he said, so biet den Erschel Gold or leck mit Ei. This is a very vulgar German language, and he's conjuring his the English Romanticism in this satirical way. Michael Eggers had summarized Jandel's method as follows. I have a quote here. Jandel's version disfigures the sound and sense of what was romantic poem by transposing it into a vague context of German Heimat, of Lieb and Hold, Mai and Baum, Bier and Deutsche Alp, almost all of which are mythical elements of traditional folklore, the naive idealization of which is satirized by the Erschel Gold and Deutsch Bayonet. Bernstein proceeds quite similarly with Celan's poem and its uncanny core. We have it here again. Bernstein's homophonic translation is to be understood as a performative act on German, on Celan's poem, as the act of a close, aloud reading of the German text by an English, respectively American speaker, whereby the sounds perceived are identified with words of the English language and rendered according to the writing norm of English. Even more than in Jandel's work, however, there are numerous places in Bernstein's translation where translation is not limited to homophonic recording, but where the translation becomes self-dynamic. And the numerical as well as the augmentative center of the poem, the homophonic procedure reaches its greatest closeness to the source text. So in the heart of the poem, we have this famous phrase, von einer Hoffnung heute auf eines Denkenden kommendes Wort im Herzen, kommendes Wort im Herzen, that is the center part of the poem, and Bernstein translates this commends word in heart's end. In Celan, this passage contains clear echoes for the German reader of the diction of Friedrich Hölderlin, whom Celan, like most readers of his generation, deeply admired. But isn't the poem's pathos, reminiscence of Hölderlin, broken here? The semantics of English, so sharply divergent at the crucial point, seem almost satirical when Bernstein renders word as word. And when he translates the coming, the commonest word, with commands, in the sense of recommends or even commands. Also, the pathetic formula in the heart, in Herzen, appears rather distorted in English to in heart's end. And he's reading this also very strong, in heart's end. The dramatic climax of the poem and the almost messianic expectation of the redeeming words tips over into the absurd, and this probably not entirely without intention. In other respects, too, the largely homophonic translation reads like an examination of what Celan is trying to capture linguistically in the poem. It is an examination emotionally evolved as well as critically distanced at the same instant. So this tension of emotion and critical distance, I think, comes to expression very much in Bernstein's translation. The strange dramaturgy of Celan's visit to Heiligershütte at the end of July 1967, the walk together in the rain-soaked moor, and the return trip in the car to Freiburg are now set in another light. At first, Bernstein's translation reads like a scanning, a subtle scanning and pondering of the source text. Arnika Augentrost, der Trunk aus dem Brunnen mit dem Sternwürfel drauf. Arnika, hold in trust, teardrop, out dem Bruce mit dem Sternwaffel broad. plant name arnica, invoked at the beginning of the poem, allows for an almost identical starting point of both versions. The second plant name, however, Augentrost, is a telling name in German. It is translated into a quasi-idiomatic phrase that does not quite match the sound of the word in German. Hold in trust is not homophonic to Augentrost, but is a semantic transposition. And it also deviates from its meaning. Hold in trust in German, in Verwahrung haben, shifts the accent from trösten, from comforting, here in the meaning of an eye-healing plant, to vertrauen, trust. It supports friends in English and in German, trust. That the designated object has a function to which its telling name appeals, however, remains as an idea even in translation, especially since hold and the following tier can also be understood imperatively in English. And this is now a very interesting shift. We don't have final words in the German original text, but in English the words can be read as imperative. The extensive absence of verb forms in the first part of Celan's poem is contrasted with an English version in which it is difficult to decide for the reader in individual cases whether the forms chosen are to be taken as verbs, adjectives, or nouns. They tentatively reproduce the phonetic structure of Celan's poems. At the same time, however, they generate in their linguistic gesture a more chanted and almost stuttering speech. And this is important. This is the diction, the way the poet speaks, is being changed in this translating procedure. Fulton explicitly names the injury, the bruise that needs healing. In Celan's poem, there's no word of bruise. There's the need of healing, but not the bruise. But the translation said it explicitly, bruise. And instead of the broad fields trunk, well, the translation leads exactly into the opposite, George. The fact that Bernstein again and again deviates from the homophonic translation strategy tempts us to notice the contrary semantics of the correspondences he has chosen, but also to listen very carefully to the way the words are spoken here. In ancient forms, in stuttering, mumbling, and not least again and again in a way of pronunciation that ultimately runs counter to the usual spelling in English. Now, the writing and the visual translation, or the sound translation, the way of pronunciation are also intentional. Possibly, it is precisely with these procedures that Bernstein seeks to express a frightening ambivalence, rendering the speaker of Celan's poem almost speechless. Celan has to say something. It's not only Heidegger who is being asked to say something. Celan is asked to write down his name in the cabin log. Celan is asked to react, to say something, but what he sees, what he feels, what he senses renders him almost speechless. There's a tension between what the eye sees and what the mouth signifies. In trunk, the German word trunk, drink, there also resonates trunken, drunk, and the star cube, Sternwürfel, may recall a cruel fate in this place. Whereas the medicinal plants at the beginning are evoked in the concrete space of the acute present like a magical defensive spell against the horror rising up from the past. So it's really a very uncanny, unheimliche situation which Celan encounters here. And we could do this, and I did it in another paper, but I will not go more into this today. But in fact, this is the classical situation of the uncanny, das Unheimliche, in the German sense of heimlich and unheimlich. This cabin, this hut was heimlich for Heidegger. But for Celan, it was the very, very idea of the unheimlich, the uncanny of what Heidegger represented. This is, in fact, what the poem is bringing to has in Skirspalt. And the poem is an expression of this uncanny experience at this very place. And in my opinion, Bernstein really gives us an impression of this feeling of the uncanny through this uncanny way of translating it, of sounding the poem in this strange language. In his essay preceding the translation, Bernstein points out that before translating, he tried to gain an overview of the background and interpretations of the poem with the help of the relevant research literature, and in particular, he mentions Pierre Jaurès' essay. Already in the first stanza, Bernstein is then able to reconstruct through homophonic translation exactly that profound uncertainty, if not shock, this Celan experience at Heidegger's place. He gains this effect solely in the phonetic transfer and in the reversal of meanings made possible thereby, and in relating it to the process of speaking itself. So I tried to compare a little bit this first poem, Denk dir, Imagine, with Paul Tottenauberg, especially in contrast of the performance of speaking, of the act of speaking, which comes to expression in Denk dir, when the poem emphatically says goes toward this other, Denk dir, imagine, you hold this very small piece in your hand, and now we have this situation of speechlessness, of shock, of horror, of the uncanny in Tottenauberg, and Bernstein, through his translation, is somehow able to reconstruct that kind of uncertainty which Celan experienced at this very place. He gains this effect, as I told, effect in the phonetic transfer and also in the reversal of meanings made possible by this method. This can be seen in various translation decisions, for example, in the inversion of the movement Der Trunk aus, which Bernstein renders with Tier Trump out. It was before Trump, you could know that. This actually means to draw a trump card. It's a different meaning, referring to the game of fate alluded to in Celan's expression with the Würfel, dice. So he transforms this idea of the dice of the fate in this expression to tear Trump out. And another example, Brunnen in German, in Celan's poem, well, becomes Bruce. Star dice on becomes star waffled drawed. This is kind of a narrow-minded or part double. It is through Bernstein's translation that we as readers of both the translation and the original text learn to recognize this poem as a whole is not solely an account of the day of the day's events. It's not only an account of what happened there. It is also and above all a poem about reading and speaking. He says what he sees, what he listens, what is being spoken there. It is a poem about reading and speaking. Bernstein's method in particular explicitly points to this important dimension of the poem. The real sensation of the day was a linguistic experience. First, it was the course of the visit in the recognition of signs at the beginning. So he goes there, he sees signs, and he tries to recognize the signs. He tries to recognize the inscription in the cottage book, which is then an act of reading, imagining, and writing. The reading turns into writing. And in the conversation during the walk through the moor and during the car ride. And the poem is second, an experience on what was said and what was concealed in what was said, way of visible silence, as I had put it before. An experience of what was expected to be said and what was refused to be said. It is an experience of speaking that the poem seeks to express in exactly what in what is said and what is not said. And it is this experience of speaking that Bernstein seeks to recreate in translation. Just as Peter Sondy in his seminal essay on Celan's poem Einführungsstretto did, as he read the poem step by step as progress through the terrain, through the landscape of the poem. And when he came to know and recognize the textual landscape of the poem and the poem as a textual landscape, it's exactly here the same situation as we experience it in Bernstein's homophonic translation of the speaking of Kurt Nauberg. Bernstein follows step by step the horror made manifest in the poem of that day on which was seen led precisely not as hope into a conversation of groundwater traces, as Celan puts it in stretto, but instead of in a crude, something crude beyond language. In the poem Kurt Nauberg, which begins with the invocation of the eyebright, the healing plant, then ends with the two enigmatic words or verses, feuchtes, feel. Then we have a reference back to the earlier poem, Einführung, which we can recognize here. This is some lines from this poem, Einführungsstretto from Celan. Maybe you know this, I'm sure you know this. This feuchtes feel is an allusion to this very important poem by Celan, where he writes zum Auggeh, zum Feuchten. So he starts with Augentrost. He starts with this sorrow, with this bruise, with this wound, which asks for healing in the plant. And in Einführung it reads zum Auggeh, zum Feuchten, zum Auggeh, zum Feuchten. Bernstein's translation then of the two final verses as folded veil establishes yet another reference. If one follows Bernstein's surface translation or homophonic translation, which is far more than that, then one can discern references to an important poetological text of Celan's from the same year of composition as Einführung, the very famous Conversation in the Mountains. And this is Celan's reaction to another philosopher, to Theodor Adorno. So Bernstein brings now together this conversation of Celan and Adorno with the conversation of Celan and Heidegger in Kurt Nauberg through his translation of the last two verses or words. I give you the quote here from the Conversation in the Mountains. Es hat sich die Erde gefaltet, der Arm, the folds. Die Erde hat sich gefaltet, the earth folded up here. Einmal und zweimal und dreimal, etc. I won't read everything, but this is really a resonance we can hear as readers of Celan's poem in this translation of Bernstein when he translates feuchtes, feel, folded. So he brings into the poem into another context. And there is a second allusion to the same text, the Conversation in the Mountains. Here I have the English translation, the earth folded up here. At the same text, Celan has another very important quote. He is talking in the Conversation in the Mountains about the eyes, Augen, aber da hängt ein Schleier davor. Nicht davor, nein, dahinter, ein beweglicher Schleier. Kaum tritt ein Bild ein, so bleibt es hängen im Gerät. Und schon ist ein Faden zur Stelle, der sich da spinnt, der sich herumspinnt ins Bild. ein Schleierfaden, spinnt sich ums Bild herum und zeugt ein Kind mit ihm, halb Bild und halb Schleier. Very important pathological idea about what happens with pictures, with images who enter our eyes and become texts, in fact, through this process of spinning and in a web or a wheel. And there we have this word wheel, which Bernstein picks up and uses for his translation. The end it has a wheel thread spins itself around the image and begets a child, half image, half wheel. So the translation of the last two words, feuchtes, viel, can be read as an allusion of Einführung des Stretto zum Auge, zum Feuchten, feuchtes, viel. In German we have the homophonic between fallen, viel, and feel in the sense of much. And Bernstein is transforming this with allusion on this very important poetological text of Celan's Conversation at the Market with the two motifs, the folding of the earth and the wheel in the eye. So the final word of Bernstein's translation, wheel, thus resumes the reference to these passages on the level of meaning, whereby folded and wheel can be understood as a semantically correct unit in English. In German, however, an inversion appears at this point, and this is very interesting. We can say in English folded, wheel, but in German, feuchtes, viel is an inversion. It's not correct or used sentence. Feuchtes, viel, in English, moist, much, is something different. The syntax is different. If this poem is spoken aloud, not just read virtually, one could understand feuchtes, viel, and then we have a correct German sentence, something which was moist, came down like the rain falls down. So Celan is obviously playing with this ambivalence. Feuchtes, viel, like the rain fell, would be a grammatically correct sentence in German and would correspond to the onset of rain on the day of the visit to Nauberg. So the ambiguity of Celan's poetic language, which had been such a concern of Stormy's to preserve in his reading, is also that of a difference between the spoken, the audible, and the written, which Bernstein brings us to recognition even more in his homophonic or surface translation. Feuchtes, viel opens at this point the sound space of yet another order, the echo again of a word of Friedrich Hölderlin, viel hat erfahren der Mensch, much has experienced man, so strained by Heidegger. According to the common understanding, Celan here alludes to Heidegger's reading of Hölderlin with his third to last stanza. Uns fährt der Mensch, viel hat erfahren, der Mensch, that is erfahren, and feuchtes, viel is kind of an allusion of this to this very important poem by Hölderlin, a part of the poem of Hölderlin's famous viel hat erfahren der Mensch, der himmlischen viele genannt, seit ein Gespräch wir sind und hören können voneinander. I think I have the quote here. Yeah, viel hat erfahren der Mensch. So it's already, again, a question of senses, how we sense it, how we experience through the senses, hearing. Such vacillation between the phonetic and the written level may have been integrated by Bernstein into his translation. On the phonetic level, the pronunciation of wheel somehow does not, can or cannot correspond to the German viel. Graphically, it can be read as a correspondence by just mirroring this German word, so to speak. Viel. It is one of several places in his translation where Bernstein actually does not translate homophonically, but where he writes exophonically, as I would like to call it. English words must be read according to German pronunciation rules to allow for the effect of homophonic translation, such as near the end, the phoneme, near the end of the poem in the translation, where Bernstein, this is the third line from the end. Here Bernstein translates the German word Pfade, Knüppelpfade in Hochmoor, and he puts the English word Pfade, but the correct English pronunciation would be fade, but here he is using this kind of exophonically. We have to pronounce it like the German Pfade. Bernstein thus seeks to use linguistic interference productively. This involves interference between German and English, as well as interference between the written image and the respective pronunciation norms. So he's also making aware this difference between the visual and the acoustical image of the poem, the question of how to pronounce the written words. Well, I will now summarize shortly these practices observed in Bernstein's translation. The first typical approach is individual words are retained because they are almost identical in spelling and pronunciation in both languages. There are, for instance, the plant names arnica or the word more for more in German. He could have used this walk too, but he uses more. The second is to be observed a typical practice of Bernstein's here. Many words, but by no means all nouns, this is important, are capitalized in the translation, as it is usual for nouns in German. This is very strange for a reader of English poems. So many capitalized nouns. They look like names there, but not all nouns are capitalized, like Trump, Bruce, Hut, Bush, book for book, naming of Wort, Wortweisend, Krude, and Deutsche. Third, there are certain words which are rendered in a way that correspond neither to a word common in German nor a word common in English. This is also very strange and new in this translation. For instance, the translation Danken for thinking. So this is a very strange word. This word does not exist neither in English nor in German. And one could see in this crude, anciently absorbed word from a critical reflex to Heidegger's thinking as a regression to older forms of language, kind of a satirical copying and mimicking of Heidegger's way of speaking, Dunken or Denken or thinking. The fourth point of interest is mixed words in words that are half German and half English. For instance, the word geschmuddelt. Based on the sound of the word, associative neologism in English occur, as in the already mentioned hold in trust, as a translation to eyebright, or in Hafnum for hope, or in Hoxmoor for Highmoor, Hochmoor, Hoxmoor. So he's inventing words. Fifth, there are words which are taken untranslated from German, but marked as foreign words in the font. When you see at the end of the poem, Tears, a folk, dear Mensch. So this is in the font, in the way of writing, made strange, but we can recognize the German word here. There, this place, the German remains untranslated. But on the other hand, and this is my sixth point, there are German words in the English translation which literally stand out from the German sounds in the English text. They can be acoustically recognized by the reader, as it were, although they do not appear in the text in this way. Thus, we have the formulation in Phasen deutlich, Celan's poem, but in the English translation, this becomes the eerie phrase in Führer deutsche Leid. In Krude, später in Führer deutsche Leid. So it's a kind of hypertroph translation where German words appear which are not present in the original text. The 7th point is spelling and pronunciation. Our intention in some places, as I mentioned above, the homophony of the translation is only guaranteed if the English spelling of the word is pronounced contrary to the contemporary linguistic norm, and that means closer to German. Often this has at the same time the effect of an archaic, of a defective way of speaking. So, for instance, drawt for drauf, had for hat, spatter for später, später for later, deutsche Leid for deutlich, Pfade for Pfade. And the 8th point, I'm close to the end. This introduces a deliberate uncertainty in the reading of the translation. It is particularly evident in the 3rd and again in the penultimate part of the poem in the treatment of the article der, the. Contrary to the English pronunciation, der or die, this is now difficult for the English reader. The German article die may be pronounced for the English reader in a different way. It would have to be read like a German word if the translation were to be consistently received as a homophonic variant. This way of pronunciation, however, at the same time prevents the realization, and that means here the pronunciation of the meaning of the English word die. The die or the dice also gets us another meaning to die, sterben, which is nevertheless visible in the context of the English word environment and which is consistently assigned to book in the translation. So this is another interesting example. The book mentioned several times in the German original text is not clearly designated in the translation, but translated differently. One times as bush or bush, once as book. In this way, Bernstein draws attention to the difference between the so disparate contributors to the book considered by Celan in the poem, when he considers Wessen Name namens auf vor dem meinen, but possibly also to pronunciation variations in German, by which speakers distinguish themselves. The German pronunciation is not the same in all parts of Germany, so it might be that Heidegger pronounced Buch a little bit different than Celan, who came from the Austrian-Hungarian part of the German language. And 9th, the rendering at the end of the 2 times the same plant name Orchis and Orchis is being rendered by Bernstein by Archis and Archis. This cannot be easily called a homophonic translation. Orchis and Orchis could be the same in English as in German. The plant name goes back to the Greek Orchis and is pronounced and spelled similarly in both languages. Bernstein could have retained it as well as the name Arnica, which he did at the beginning. Instead, in the transition from Orchis, O to R, and Arc is he himself, so Bernstein himself, establishes now a reference, an arc, to the opening verse, arc is an arc. And this appears on the one hand like an anagram to arnikar, arc is an arc, arnikar. On the other hand, it establishes a new context to, I think, Gertrude Stein's dictum, a rose is a rose, a rose, an arc is an arc, from her poem Sacred Emily. In addition, Bernstein renders orchis and orchis single by eyes rearm in the same verse. So together with the translation of the phrase unleavened in the preceding verse by uneyed and bent, Bernstein thus ties, this is important, he ties this verse back to the eye motif from the beginning and implicitly to the eye motif at the end of the poem with the folded wheel, the wheel and the eye. So if we take all these observations together, and I could still more add the extent to which Bernstein's surface translation of Celan's Kurt Nauberg goes beyond the practice of homophonic translation becomes clear. Bernstein himself calls this quasi-homophonic version. That is, and I have this final quote here for him. Well, no. Sorry, I think I had it. Bernstein calls this a quasi-homophonic version that is written with primary attention to bringing into the American some correlatives to the sound and rhythm of German, a kind of approaching Celan by way of this resounding in the English homophonic translation. Bernstein's translation formulates a scanning of the poem's text, a scanning of its visual and its acoustic form, as well as a scanning of what is expressed in these words. Like the poem itself, the translation is a mental repetition of that visit to the hut and the conversation that accompanied it, in the course of which the things Celan became aware of were scanned by himself and written down now in the notice, like in the notebook of the poem, scanned with the eyes, with the ear, with a sense of memory. In memory, they are then recapitulated as processes of writing or as processes of speaking. Bernstein's translation preserves this extremely deliberate, probing, slow-moving moment of the poem. It is an independent reading, however, hardly inferior to readings by scholarly interpreters, I think. We can learn much out of this interpretation. I'm very much at my very end. The homophony-oriented approach of this translation allows Bernstein, in this word-by-word scanning of the language surface, to trace how the poem itself explores the relationship between the responsive and the unsayable. So what can be said and what cannot be said, what have to be silenced, and we see this silence visibly standing around. The performative gesture of his reading, of Bernstein's reading, which is captured in the surface translation, makes dimensions of the text perceptible in the repeated working through, which only become recognizable in the difference of the two versions. And this at the end is very important. Surface translations can, in principle, only meaningfully be read in view of the translated text, only in comparison with the translated text itself. But since translation becomes clear as a procedure that aims at gaining insight in relation to the text, an intention that actually seems to be the domain of scholarly secondary text. On the other hand, it leads out of the dilemma of representative speaking, and this is also interpreted. It is translating, but it is not translating, meaning it helps us to get out of this dilemma of representative speaking, for it no longer represents the original under restriction of that which must of necessity be lost in translation, but it represents the speaking of the original on a level which sees itself precisely as the speaking sought by Celan. And so this translation is kind of a conversation with the speaking of the original itself. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. I don't know if maybe I have a question, but I don't want to. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
entfernen, gibt es da eine Systematik, wo man zum Beispiel Bush-Naming und die so erwartetes Verses vorkommen, ausgeschrieben sind? Oder ist es auch so eine Strategie, um Verwirrung, diese Vertrennung auch vielleicht zu erzeugen? Und die zweite Frage, das wäre so dieses Wort, so verschwunden. Das, wo ich das gelesen habe, habe ich so an Britisch gedacht, tatsächlich, und an Wörter, die als Britische, dann ins Englische auch reingekommen sind, auch daraus eine Verbindung gibt.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich habe das versucht zu erwähnen, dass es sehr auffällig ist, diese Kapitalisierung, diese Großschreibung, die er benutzt und die man im Englischen eigentlich nur einsetzt, wenn es sich um Namen handelt. Ich hatte den Eindruck, dass er hier quasi Namen macht aus den Worten, aber es ist ganz klar, dass er nicht alle Worte, die wir als nominal kennen sollten, groß schreibt. Das sind nicht die deutsche Schreibweise hier wiederholt. Ich habe viel überlegt, welche Worte er kapitalisiert und welche nicht, ob es ein System ist, was ich dem nehmen kann. Ich glaube, es ist eher Teil dieser Verunsicherungsstrategie, dieser Strategie, also jedes Wort genau anzuschauen, wann wird ein Wort ein Name, was kann man hier hervorheben. Aber ich kann nicht jetzt es eindeutig sagen, diese Worte dieser Qualität werden kapitalisiert. Und die zweite Frage mit dem Schmuddel und dem Jiddischen, das hier mit hineinkommt, man hat versucht, also wirklich diese unbekannten Worte zu identifizieren und nicht zu sagen, ich kenne dieses Wort oder das Wort gibt es, ich kenne es nicht oder es gibt es nicht. Es kann immer sein, dass es doch irgendwo einen Nachweis dafür gibt. Aber ich glaube, auch hier liegt eher der Fall vor, dass er mit diesem Jargon spielen will, also solche Assoziationsfelder öffnen will, aber sie nicht unbedingt erfüllt. Also die gesamte Technik dieser Übersetzung ist, dieses Moment des Unheimlichen, der Verunsicherung zum Ausdruck zu bringen. Und das, was Celan in der Büchner-Preisrede sagt, zu diesem Punkt des ganz Fremden gehen, dahin durchgehen und wieder zutage treten und als ein anderes wieder zutage. Und diese Begegnung mit dem Unheimlichen, genau das ist das, was das Gedicht zum Ausdruck bringt. Und es war mir einfach wichtig, zu versuchen zu argumentieren, ja, es ist ein Gedicht, das über den Konflikt mit Heidegger verfasst worden ist, aber daran erschöpft es sich nicht. Was das Gedicht sprachlich macht in seinem Verfahren, ist nochmal was ganz anderes. Und wie spannend das ist, macht uns eigentlich Bernstein mit dieser Übersetzung nochmal viel bewusster und ermöglicht uns ein anderes Sehen und ein anderes Lesen dieses Gedichts. Das ist, glaube ich, das Wichtige, dass man hier dieses Übersetzungsverfahren als Erkenntnisverfahren einsetzen kann und dass er genau das, was Celan im Meridian beschreibt, als Zentrum seiner poetischen Bewegung, als Zentrum des Gedichts, dass man das hier nochmal mitverfolgen kann, als ein ganz genaues Lesen, aber auch eine Hommage an das Sprechen von Celan.
Maybe I just wanted to this reference to Argentus. I remember a letter from Celan to his wife, Giselle, in which he talked about that I think he sent it from Geneva. And he was talking about Argentus and the fact that he used to collect these flowers when he was in their concentration camp in Moldau. And so I found this element maybe an element of uncanny feeling and experience, because if you remember, this was in the past period of Celan, and also maybe of the fact that Heidegger could find a home, a place he could call home, this hut, this cottage, while he actually spots and actually couldn't. And the fact that it was recovered in a clinic, maybe it's a sort of demonstration of that. But
I don't know. I'm just thinking. Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't mention this very important and famous letter Celan later wrote to his wife from Geneva, where he was living for some months as a translator for an international organization to make some money for the family. This is important because the context is also translating. And, he is while he's walking in the mountains above of Geneva, he is recollecting another mountain, and then at this very moment in the Black Forest, he is now connecting with these different moments. I'm not sure if I would go so far to say, well, those Nazis, they had a home, they had a hut, they had a peaceful place. They were not in a difficult situation as we were at the time of the war, where we didn't have to eat and we were in this terror and we didn't know if we were survived. I don't know if this is something we exposed want to see in this poem and read in the poem. What for me was striking is the idea he goes there and he's really screening or scanning what he is seeing and said, I see this. This is a plant, but the plant is also a sign. And then he starts to fume about the connection between the signifier and the signified. And now we have the same plant, or the same plant appearing here and there and again at different times. And through this reappearance of the plant, it becomes a signifier, it becomes a sign of memory, like the Madeleine Foucault's. We see something, we smell something, we hear music, we listen to a music, we listened when we were in childhood, and then all this recollection comes again. So I think it's a very theoretical poem, in fact. It is about reading and about science. What does this sign mean? Does this wooden star in the shape of a star or a dice, does this really signify something? Does this signifier has a reality? Where is reality? What really happens? This is what the poem is step by step, verse by verse, line by line, talking about. So my suggestion was to really read this poem in the context of the linguistic terms, exactly as a way of working with language and asking what is the situation between the science, acoustical science, written science, symbolical science, and reality, and what we are doing in all of them. What does speaking mean? What does seeing mean? And not speaking mean? This visible silence in the poem is really something that struck me very much. But nevertheless, it is an uncanny situation. And I also tried two different approaches to this poem. Maybe we could have a conference on this poem. One very interesting thing is reading this poem from the perspective of eco-poetics today. What do we use? A well is not the same as the spring. The spring is a very important symbol for poetry for centuries and so on. But here it is the well, so it's something man-made, and the well has a significant shape. And the Sternwürfel is not a star, it's something man-made. And those plants are used for men. This is not the nature itself. So it could be very interesting to read this poem, the whole poem, from the poetics, from the standpoint of eco-poetics today. It's a very, very fruitful way of reading it, I think. And there are different or more opportunities to approaching this poem, not only from the question, what did Heidegger say or what did he not say? This is just one, but I think there may be many others. And it is about violence. It is about war. It is about the clash of different cultures, different persons. All this, what was so important in this very year of '67, is present somehow, more or less, in this poem. And I think we are obliged to go a step further and start reading it more than from this perspective of what did Heidegger say or what did Taylor more from Heidegger say. Maybe I think she will try.
Allora, penso che possiamo really grateful for your presence and this really interesting seminar.
I just want one thing. I said there are two more approaches to this poem. One is ecopoetics. The other one, I wouldn't miss to say this because it's also very important. This is from the perspective of the discussion of hospitality by Derrida and by others, because Celan is invited to go into this hut as an intruder. He is accepted as a guest in this hut. And now he, as a guest, he is forced to write down something into the book. So it's something like a turning point of this gesture of hospitality. And I think this would give another very, very interesting approach to read it against and with the concept of hospitality. And just to say this.
I'm happy that we managed to organize everything. Come si fa a terminare questo? Termina questo.